If you've ever stared at your banking app at 2 in the morning, doing the same math you did last night and the night before that, and still not believing the number, this is for you. That feeling in your chest when the balance loads. That held breath before your eyes find the digits. It isn't really about money. It never was. And there was a man who carried that exact weight centuries before banking apps existed, who finally learned how to set it down. Today I want to tell you about a monk who was asked a single question by the wealthiest merchant in his province, a question that terrifies most of us so much we never say it out loud. The monk's answer took 7 words. Just 7. We'll get there. But first you need to understand the man who asked it, because his fear built an empire, and his empire never once let him rest. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, what's the one money worry that follows you into every room, even the good ones? The promotion, the vacation, the quiet Sunday morning. If you have one, you're not alone. Most people carry the exact same fear, dressed in different numbers. The town sat where 2 rivers met, and everything that moved through it seemed to move through Devaram's hands first. Bolts of dyed silk stacked to the rafters of his warehouses. Sacks of pepper and cardamom that perfumed the air 3 streets over. Ledgers so thick his clerks needed both arms to carry them. By the time he was 40, Devaram owned more warehouses than any merchant who had come before him. And still, every evening, he walked the length of his largest storeroom counting what was inside it, running his palm along the sacks as if checking that they hadn't quietly vanished since morning. He had a particular habit that his household never mentioned aloud. Before bed, he would sit at his writing desk with a candle and a ledger, and he would add the same numbers he had added 12 hours earlier. Not because the numbers had changed, because he needed one more time to feel them add up to enough. They never quite did. There was always a shipment that could be lost at sea, a rival who might undercut his prices, a bad season that could empty a warehouse in a month. Devaram was, by every outward measure, a wealthy man, and by every private measure, a frightened one. His wife had stopped asking him to come to bed at a reasonable hour years ago. His sons had learned not to ask for anything that cost money, because even a small request seemed to make their father's shoulders rise toward his ears. He told himself this was what responsibility looked like. He told himself that once he reached a certain number, the feeling in his chest would finally loosen. He had believed this for so long that he had stopped noticing it was a belief at all. It had simply become the shape of his days. It was his eldest son who first mentioned the monk. There was an old teacher, the boy said, who lived in the hills above the second river in a hut with no door, who owned, as far as anyone could tell, exactly 1 bowl. Merchants sometimes visited him when their fortunes turned, or when their sleep abandoned them, or when a wife or a physician insisted they see someone. Devaram laughed at the suggestion. What could a man with 1 bowl possibly understand about a business with 40 employees and 3 ongoing shipments at sea? But that night, the numbers in his ledger added up wrong 3 separate times, and he found himself before dawn, having his horse saddled. The climb took most of the morning, and by the time Devaram reached the hut, his fine clothes were dust-colored, and his breath came hard. The monk was sitting outside on a flat stone, mending a small tear in his robe, with the kind of patience Devaram hadn't felt in decades. He did not stand when Devaram approached. He simply looked up and waited. Devaram, unused to waiting for anyone, found himself talking before he had planned to. He described the warehouses, the ships, the numbers that never settled, the nights he couldn't sleep because somewhere a figure in a ledger might be wrong. He described, without quite meaning to, the fear underneath all of it, that no matter how much he gathered, some part of him was certain it still wouldn't be enough. But what he didn't know was that the monk had heard this exact confession, almost word for word, from a dozen wealthy men before him. Not because their fortunes were unusual, because the fear itself was never really about the fortune. The monk listened without interrupting, which unsettled Devaram more than any question could have. When the merchant finally ran out of words, the monk set down his mending and asked a question so plain that Devaram almost missed its weight entirely. How much, the monk asked, would be enough? Devaram opened his mouth to answer and found nothing there. He had never once asked himself the question in those exact terms. He had asked how much more, how much faster, how much safer. He had never asked how much would be enough, because some part of him had always assumed the answer was simply more than he currently had. Remember this detail. It matters later. The monk did not press him. He returned to his mending, and Devarim sat there on the dusty ground outside a hut with no door. A man worth more than the entire village below, unable to name a single figure that would let him rest. He came back the next week, and the week after that. He told himself he was testing the old man, the way he tested a new supplier before committing to a contract. In truth, he was returning because it was the only place all month where his chest didn't feel tight. On his fourth visit, he watched the monk eat his single daily meal from his single bowl, slowly, with what looked almost like reverence for each spoonful. Devarim, who ate rich meals off silver plates and could not remember the last time he'd tasted any of them, asked why the old man lived with so little. And this is where everything changed. The monk didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked Devarim to describe, in detail, everything he owned. Devarim began eagerly, warehouse by warehouse, ship by ship, feeling for the first time in weeks like he was on familiar ground. But the list took nearly an hour, and somewhere in the middle of it, listing sacks of grain he would never personally see, gold he would never personally spend. Devarim heard his own voice and didn't recognize it. It sounded like a man reciting a debt, not a man describing a fortune. The monk let him finish. Then he asked a second question, quieter than the first. And how much of it do you feel tonight, in your body? Devarim had no answer for that either. He realized, sitting there, that he could describe his wealth in exhaustive detail and still not locate a single moment in years when he had actually felt secure because of it. The feeling of safety he'd been chasing since he was a young trader with one cart and one mule had never once arrived, no matter how many warehouses he added. He had simply moved the finish line every time he approached it, so quietly he'd never noticed himself doing it. He rode home that evening differently than he'd ridden home in years, not because anything had changed in his warehouses, because something had shifted in the space where he kept his fear. That night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he sat down to dinner with his family before the candles had burned halfway down. His younger son, startled to see his father at the table at all, asked hesitantly whether something was wrong at the warehouses. Devarim laughed, and said no, nothing was wrong. He had simply lost track of time in a good way for once. His wife watched him from across the table with an expression he couldn't quite name. It took him a moment to recognize it as hope, but the fear did not leave all at once. It rarely does. Over the following days, old habits pulled at him the way a current pulls at a swimmer who has only just learned to float. He caught himself twice reaching for his ledger before bed out of pure reflex, his hand moving before his mind had caught up. Both times, he set it back down. Both times, it took real effort, the kind of effort no one watching him would have noticed, because it happened entirely in the space behind his eyes. He returned one final time, on a morning heavy with the smell of rain coming off the second river. He found the monk in his usual place, and this time Devarim didn't describe his warehouses at all. He simply asked the question he'd been circling for weeks, the one underneath all the others, the one he'd never dared ask out loud to anyone, including himself. When does it stop? When is it finally enough? The monk looked at him for a long moment, not unkindly, the way you look at someone you've been waiting for. Then he set down his bowl and answered, "You already have enough to stop now." 7 words. Devarim waited for more. Some qualification, some formula for how much a man in his position truly needed to feel safe. But the monk offered nothing further. He simply picked his bowl back up and continued eating, as though he had answered a question about the weather. Devarim sat with those 7 words the way he'd once sat with his ledgers, turning them over, searching for the number they must be hiding, and slowly he understood there was no number hidden inside them at all. The monk wasn't telling him he had accumulated a sufficient sum. He was telling him that the entire search for a sufficient sum had been the wrong search from the beginning. Enough was never going to arrive as a figure in a ledger. It was a decision, available to him at any hour, in any warehouse, with any balance. He had simply never chosen it, because some quieter part of him believed that choosing it would mean he'd stopped trying, stopped protecting his family, stopped being the responsible man he'd built his whole identity around. He rode home in the rain that afternoon and did not open his ledger that night for the first time in 11 years. That merchant is you every time you refresh your banking app, hoping the number will finally make you feel safe. It is you when you get the raise and feel relief for exactly 3 days before the fear resettles at a new, slightly higher altitude. Devarum's warehouses are not so different from your savings goal, your next promotion, your someday number, the version of enough you keep pushing further out because some part of you suspects that arriving there would mean lowering your guard. And lowering your guard feels dangerous. Here is the single idea underneath this whole story. The fear of not having enough and the actual amount you have are two almost entirely separate things. You already know this somewhere. You've likely seen people with very little who move through the world at ease, and people with a great deal who cannot sit still for an hour without checking a number. Money can solve real specific problems. It can pay a bill, cover a treatment, buy a night of rest in a warmer room. What it cannot do, no matter how much of it accumulates, is manufacture the feeling of safety from the outside in. That feeling is built somewhere else entirely, in the quiet, private decision to notice what is already sufficient, right now, in this exact moment, regardless of what the ledger says. This isn't a call to stop working, stop saving, stop planning for your family's future. Devarum didn't sell his warehouses. He kept trading for the rest of his life. What changed wasn't his balance. It was the question he asked himself while looking at it. Instead of asking how much more he needed to finally feel safe, he began asking whether he could feel safe, even briefly, with what already sat in front of him. That single shift in the question is the difference between a life spent chasing a number that keeps retreating and a life spent noticing, again and again, that you have already arrived more often than you realized. So here are 3 small things you can do, starting tonight. First, before you sleep, write down 3 things money cannot buy that you already possess, not aspirations. Things you hold right now, this evening. A person who checks on you, a body that still carries you through your days, a skill no market crash can take from you. Second, the next time you open your banking app, pause for 3 full breaths before you look at the number and notice what you're feeling in your chest in that pause. That feeling arrived before the number did. It will still be there, in some form, no matter what the number says. Naming that is the beginning of separating the fear from the figure. Third, choose one evening this week to sit, like Devarum did on his hillside visits, without your phone, without a ledger of any kind, and simply ask yourself the monk's question in your own words. How much would actually be enough tonight to let your shoulders drop half an inch? Write the answer down. You may find, as Devarum did, that the honest answer is smaller and closer than the number you've been chasing. None of these 3 steps will change what's in your account by morning. That was never the point. Devarum's warehouses looked exactly the same the day after his final visit to the hillside as they had the day before. What had changed was the question running quietly underneath his every decision, and that quiet question shapes far more of your days than the number itself ever could. A person who has made peace with enough spends differently, sleeps differently, speaks to their children differently than a person still running from a fear they've never named out loud. The steps above are simply small, repeatable ways of practicing that peace until it stops feeling like an exception and starts feeling like the ground you stand on. Picture him now, years later, an old man himself, sitting outside his own warehouse at dusk, not counting anything, simply watching the light change color over the river the way the monk once watched the light change color over the hills. He still worked, he still built, but he no longer needed the number to move before he could rest. In his own words spoken to his son one evening on that same stretch of riverbank, enough was never a wall he had to build high enough to feel safe behind. It was a door he had to choose, again and again, to walk through. And that is the real inheritance of this story, for you as much as for him. You do not need a larger number to earn the right to feel steady tonight. You are allowed to set the ledger down before it says what you want it to say. The peace you are waiting for on the other side of a bigger balance is available in smaller doses on this side of it too, the moment you decide to look for it. If this story gave you even one moment of peace, there are more waiting for you here. Next time, I'll tell you about a king who traded his crown for a single afternoon of ordinary life, and what he discovered he missed most when it was gone. Until then, walk gently, hold loosely,